Beginning. Today's discussion is mostly about the physiology of bone, the way it's formed, and the hormonal controls. That's kind of I'm going to try to do to make life easier for you is to try to point out as clearly as I can stuff that's not on the test. I mean, maybe like I said, when students don't do as well, I mean, there's a lot of. It's kind of like my kids never did that, couldn't do that. You know, in school, you get parents, oh, little Johnny, my kid would never do that. Believe me, my kids did. When they called us, it was like, okay, what did he do now? What did she do now? But it's the same thing. What teachers do, the analogy is what teachers would say, oh, the students are dumb, or they're not trying hard enough, they're not working. That's a very bad statement to make. It's not easy. And I said it to the other class, and I will say it to you. This is the first time we've ever had everybody in lab having to do this lab in this accelerated fashion. It's never happened before, and that has to be impactful. And so maybe I was remiss. You know, I didn't do enough to tell you what's not on the test, and then you're studying too much of what's not on the test and not enough of what is on the test. That's the point I'm trying to make. You keep as an instructor, as a teacher of any level, making the presumption that you're infallible is wrong. Okay? It's like I said, my kid would never do that. Trust me. I was happy that was all they did. My daughter, this gives you an idea how long ago, she's going to be 40 in February. I got a call because she dyed in 8th grade, 7th grade, because she dyed her hair a different color in the back. That we had to come home and get her. She couldn't be that 8th grade. Are you kidding me? Did I miss something? Would that happen now? No. Be happy if it's, it could be rainbow color. Whatever. She's being a distraction. I know. She's a distraction wherever she goes. I'm kidding. Moving on. So, moving on. Bone development. The process of bone becoming bone is called ossification. Okay. Most of the time, it comes from a cartilage shell, and the cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Those are all important to us. That's called, as you'll see shortly, enchondral or endochondral, which means in cartilage, ossification bone forms. Starts early, and by and large, you'll see the numbers. Typical time that the bones stop growing in young people, in women 16 to 18, and men 18 to 21, with a certain amount of variation. I tend to think in women younger, and in men much more variation. That's there. But it's continuously, actually saying the wrong syllable, it's continuously being remodeled, repaired, replaced throughout a lifetime, as you will see. So, and this gives you an idea about what's going on. So the big name to remember for this, and I use both terms, endo or enchondral ossification, is replacing the hyaline cartilage shell. That's the vast, vast majority of bones that are there. Okay. So most of the skeleton, certainly all of the extremities. Really, the bones that have this, and that's why I'm mentioning it in passing, and you don't have to know the process. The process of intramembranous bone ossification is not well understood. Basically, it's the bones in the skull and your clavicles. Like magically, in the tissue it's forming, all of a sudden bone starts to form between a couple of what appear to be membranes. Go figure. It would be naive to think that there's a great understanding of how the human body develops in utero. It's important to understand it, and with the advent of ultrasound, of being able to use ultrasound and being able to effectively do computer modeling of that ultrasound signal so we can see a baby growing and all of that, there's a lot of information to be gleaned from that. Okay? It's cartilage. The reason we can see it, cartilage has density, and bone has a different density, so we can really look to see that it's growing properly. If there's anything that's a warning sign or a positive sign, etc. So essentially, all the bones inferior to the base of the skull, except the clavicles. You want to think of it that way? Okay. It starts late, comparatively speaking, a couple months of development. The cartilage is there, and a lot of this, the reason we're acquainted with this, a lot of it is understanding. We're particularly of skeletal remains, what we call forensically, things that are found like that from maybe a legal standpoint, that type of stuff. Okay. And what happens effectively is this, short course, because I'm not going to go into all this. I'm going to show you the ossification centers. I'm going to go through the slides. There's a lot of material there. I don't emphasize that. That's short for, you're not going to be asked questions about it other than what are the points of emphasis that I'm going to have. Effectively, cartilage is destroyed and turns into bone when it becomes exposed to blood. Blood is an erosive agent to cartilage. It damages it. When you have a joint injury, when we talk about joints, a thing that's going to happen when there's blood inside of a joint is going to cause the cartilage to undergo some kind of deterioration. Whether or not that affects you in a lifetime or not, that's a different story. But the more often it happens, you have a thing called post-traumatic arthritis. It might take 25 years or more to show up, but it's damaging the cartilage. Bone, cartilage dies when it's exposed to blood. That's the take home. Okay, and why it forms and why blood supply enters in a particular area, not terribly clear. But it goes into something, and we're talking effectively, the best one to understand this, best way to understand this rather, is to understand, look at the long bone model. It enters in the center of the shaft of the long bone. It's called the primary center. That's where the blood vessels infiltrate. Remember, the cartilage is there. It's got a sheath, like the periosteum we talked about last time, called perichondrium. Not a whole lot different, but rather than encasing bone, it's encasing cartilage. As soon as that gets entered, that starts to change it into this really important structure we call periosteum. And the mesenchymal cells are these magical cells that in connective tissue that can be anything, fibrous, cartilage, bone, so they can change and go backwards or forwards and change, depending on the circumstances. So that's really what they're talking about there. And I don't care about all of these steps. Okay, I don't care about the bone collar forming. Why did it form? Okay, the central cartilage in the diaphysis calcifies, periosteal buds, etc. The bud, etc. All that stuff. That's of no benefit to you going forward, I think, and all of those things. So I'm going to show you what goes on rather than go through the steps. And they're summarizing it. The big players are not so much here. Why that bone collar formed, I don't know. Why would I ask you about it? Or why we begin to see deterioration? I mean, these are changes that probably are associated with a certain degree of indirect blood supply change here, my guess. And if I'm guessing, you certainly don't need to. Okay? This is the big player. Once blood begins to enter, that's what I talked about before. That's something you saw called the nutrient foramen or the nutrient blood supply. That's immediately going to make a very, very, comparatively speaking, rapid change to bone, particularly in the middle of the shaft. Sometimes after that, you're going to get what we call secondary. This is the primary center. Secondary centers that occur at the ends. The fancy name for ends, the plural is an epiphyses. Epiphysis is the singular, if you're interested. And so we call it the epiphyseal blood supply is a separate blood supply. And what eventually happens is it transitions this to cancellous or spongy bone, and the shaft into mostly cortical bone with some spongy bone. Okay, these things show up. They are growth plates. Okay, another name for growth plate is the epiphyseal plate. That's where bone elongates, shapes, all of that stuff. That's present in growing bone. When it's no longer present, bone stops growing. It's not going to reappear. there are surgical techniques where you can cause bone that has grown and to make it grow more. It's very elaborate. It's something very, very briefly was developed by a brilliant doctor in Russia to treat a very famous Olympic athlete back in the 60s. And it's called the method of, his name is Ilizarov. And he basically found a way to make bones longer. And it was very, very useful for people with injuries, explosive devices, that type of stuff. Fascinating. Nothing you need to know, but giving you some context. It doesn't mean we can't make bone grow if we need to. I'm not talking about growing it in a laboratory or anything like that, but actually having a technique to make a bone grow. Very painful, by the way. Nevertheless, these are the growth plates. When the bone is completely grown, they disappear. Every textbook mentions something called an epiphyseal line. I operated on bones for 25 years. I never saw one. I don't know why they talk about this stuff. It's got to be something, and I told the other class, there's a difference between people who write these textbooks and do these PowerPoints, particularly the ones who write the textbooks. They're classroom people. They're scholars. They're not clinically oriented for the most part. So you'll even hear different phrases, different ways. In a hospital environment or a clinical environment, we use different terminology. Okay, things that are textbooky don't necessarily apply. You'll hear different ways that they're referred to, different approaches. It's just and something you get used to over the years. So I operated on bones. Nobody said, "Oh, look for that epiphyseal line," because nobody's ever seen it. Maybe it's some remarkably microscopic thing on X-rays that I never saw. I'll buy it. The intramembranous thing, no idea why it happens. Again, magically, some kind of mesenchymal, this generic connective tissue, magically starts to form bone. Okay, and it's a very unusual bone. The skulls, those flat bones, are like sandwiches. Remember, they have cortical bone on the outside and cancellous bone on the inside, and a lot of marrow. It's sort of like a thin shell, the classic. And you'll see one of the fractures we look at on Friday will be a depressed skull fracture. And so what happens? The centers are formed, okay, and magically changed into osteoblasts, secrete osteoid, blah, 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 blah. If you want to read that, fine. Never going to answer your question. Okay, good enough? Don't study it. Waste your time. Don't look at it. All you have to know is this is what ends up. You have, eventually this is going to form compact. You saw the illustration already. The actual micrograph of it. You end up with a thin shell, relatively speaking, of compact or cortical bone on the outside, and a whole lot of cancellous bone, and that's in bone marrow on the inside. You can go back and look at that picture in the previous PowerPoint. The way these structures grow, okay, when they talk about interstitial, that's the one we're going to refer to the most, is elongation. That's the one that effectively ceases, barring some unusual surgical technique, when you and I reach bone maturity at around the end of puberty. Okay, thickness is called appositional growth. That's remodeling. That's changes. Bones don't have, until a child starts to weight bear, until they begin to move around, put their head up, stop crawling, begin to weight bear, all of those types of things. That's when we begin to see those neat trochanters and tubercles and tuberosities, spines and stuff like that. All that neat stuff that you learned about terminology-wise in lab begin to form and become distinctive. If you're very active, very physical, here though you'll see the analogy of the weightlifter. Okay, they become more and more. Again, it's going to go back to that thing, Wolff's Law. Bone forms as the forces that are on it. The more force you put on the bone, the more distinctive those landmarks are going to be. The thicker, the heavier the bone is. It just is. If you're relatively sedentary, not a whole lot. It will change. So long bones, lengthwise, interstitial, same for cartilage. And increase in thickness, appositional. Those terms are important. And then they stop growing effectively at the end. You would call that the hallmark of the end of adolescence. Indeed, yeah, facial changes are a little bit different. Okay, and sometimes there's other factors that might impact them. Not necessarily. I guess I maybe either way. I'd say there's a certain degree of facial distinctiveness. So you go back when you're 25, go back and look at your high school yearbook. Okay, you might see some subtle changes. Some people might look the same. It's awful. I went. I've gone to both my 40th and my 50th. No comments. High school Don't you dare. 50th high school reunion, and there's some of those people who just look the same. I mean, they look great. I'm thinking work done. I'm thinking that'll be my daughter. She's very cognizant of her appearance. So voila. This is important because there's clearly a test question coming from this. Interstitial growth, the growth plate. Another name is the epiphyseal plate. You have to be familiar with both of those. That stays the same. It doesn't change. And what happens is it's balanced out. Okay, so even though it's changing, it's kind of moving away. Okay, the area where we see the growth plate on an X-ray has a fancy name. It's called the quiescent, which means resting zone. And what happens as the cartilage grows and goes away from the growth plate, it begins to change. And it changes because it's being exposed to the blood that's already in the bony portion. It's kind of like this. This is what I drew here. This area is already bone. Okay? This already has a significant blood supply. The growth plate here is actually the cells are growing toward the middle of the bone. So you'll see shortly in the description. They go from the growth plate toward the diaphysis or the shaft. And by doing so, they begin to change. They begin to grow or enlarge. But as they get closer to the blood supply, they deteriorate. And when things deteriorate, they tend to acquire calcium. They calcify. You will learn, here's the test question. Let's see it. You're right. Okay. As you will learn, that area where we call it the zone of calcified cartilage, the structural weak point in the growth plate. The structural weak point in growing bone is the growth plate. When a child or someone whose growth plates are open fractures a bone, we know it's going to be at least in the growth plate to some extent. The actual zone that it occurs is this calcification zone, known as the zone of calcified cartilage. When things in your body begin to calcify that aren't supposed to, say that people have hardening of the arteries, other things we'll see, we'll see calcium in their arteries. That's not going to go away. It's already been enough. The calcium is going to be, now it's there. You just have to deal with it. So calcification is something that occurs. It's got a fancy name you don't have to know, called dystrophic calcification. Something that's dystrophic or not growing or is damaged picks up calcium. It can happen anywhere. And if there's too much calcium in the bloodstream, even healthy tissue can acquire it. So calcium's got to be regulated, and that's part of today's presentation. Because to me, that may be job number one of bone. Controlling calcium, being the bank for calcium, and having at least in a set of controls. It's not. I'd like to be able to go to my bank and get, $100,000 out. Unfortunately, I don't have that in there. I might have the 100, but that 1,000 part I don't have. Like to. And then when it begins to turn into bone, they call it ossification. Here you're going to see it. So the cartilage on the side pointing toward the shaft, diaphysis, that's where it's dividing the most rapidly. And as they move, they're kind of pushing the ends away. You'll see it. Pushing the epiphyses, the ends, top and bottom, whatever you want to call it, farther away. They begin to enlarge. Why is this happening? It's not so much that they're older, but they're getting closer to the blood supply, and they begin to erode. Blah, 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 blah. Calcification, eroding, damaging. Now it picks up the calcium, and here's the big thing: the cartilage cells die and deteriorate. That's why it's weak. Okay, and then it begins to form bone. And you don't have to know any of this stuff is not all the types of things, the spicules and what the osteo. Don't worry about it. Look at it on an X-ray, and we look at X-rays the next time. Okay, why is this not a fracture? Well, this is obviously the femur and tibial junction. Here's the fibula. Because if you see a line that's relatively smooth, fractures are typically, when you can see the line, are typically irregular. And if you're not sure, let's say someone came in with a right knee, a 12-year-old with their right knee hurting, okay, you might take pictures of both. We did to make sure, because sometimes you would see an irregularity in the growth plate on one side and not the other. So you do bilateral contrast. I do not know if they still do these things now. It's naive to think. We see all these doctor shows on TV. Oh, send them for a scan right now. It's expensive. X-rays are cheap. CT scans, which are better for bone than X-rays, are really just computerized, elaborate series of X-rays that we're able to basically look at things almost bone three-dimensionally. They're great for bone. MRIs are much better for soft tissue, though we use them for bone too. But you're doing $1,000, multi-$1,000 tests where $100 tests will do. So I understand them. We're conditioned to see this stuff on TV. In the real world, it doesn't exist like that. I mean, we have two wonderful Class A trauma centers. I mean, in spitting distance, comparatively, in Pittsburgh, at AGH and at Presby. This is a microgram. So here's the zone. Here's the cartilage at rest. Not at rest, but nothing really happening, visibly at rest. Here's the cartilage proliferating. The signals, the bone's starting to elongate, interstitial growth. That's what gives it the signal, as you'll see, growth hormone, typically the player in this. Then begins to hypertrophy. See how the cells enlarge? Then they begin to, as they're enlarging, they get damaged, they calcify, they change, and then they become bone. This is the weak part right here. So if we were able, and it's a consistent finding, been around for a long time. So near the end of adolescence, whatever that is, with this, and again, the signals are probably related to both growth hormone and in men, testosterone, and in women, estrogen are the big players. So the reproductive hormones are, because that's what are released or start to be released. The big growth spurts, there's typically a pre-adolescent growth spurt and an adolescent growth spurt that continue on for X amount of time. And then higher levels actually stop the process. If you get it in, and I do not know if you're going to discuss that in endocrine or not. It's a pretty advanced way to discuss it. It's there, I think, just to know the basic. But that's basically what happens when we hit puberty. Then ovaries and testes start to get busy, and these chemicals play a role in causing these spurts of growth. In little ones, I mean, I would just be speculating, and I won't endeavor to. I mean, I know with my own kids, when all of a sudden they start eating everything in sight. 5-year-old, buying more shoes. I mentioned between my wife and I, we have 8 children. That used to be his. Wear it anyway. So all of this happens, the plates close. Effectively, they come together and it's all bone. If that line's there, good luck. 16 to 18, I think, is a better range. I actually think it's younger than 18. In men, 18 to 21 is probably the range. There is a lot. In families, somebody goes off to college, goes out after high school, and they come back a couple of years later, you haven't seen them, and they're 3 inches tall. The most famous case that people of my generation are familiar with, even people who are a little younger are familiar with, one of the great basketball players of all time, not it really could have been, if he chose to, was on the first San Antonio Spurs championship team in 1988, named David Robinson, 7'1" center. When he entered the Naval Academy, he was a 6'4" point guard. Grew 9 inches in his first summer. 9. That's why he was so good, because he had the skills of a point guard and was a center. So he was in that first team and eventually that team won 5 championships. He was there for the first, maybe for the first 2. He couldn't. He got out of the Navy early because he was so tall. He only had to say normally you have to serve 4 years if you're an academy graduate. He only had to serve 2. If you've ever been on a ship, a real naval vessel, the doors are not that big. Just not. If somebody's 6'3" or 6'4", you're always bending over. I mean, on a submarine, you're crawling. You're like crawling. Moving on. So that's not unusual. Those types of things. But growth is so variable. I was as tall as I ever was in 9th grade. It's just the way it works. There's no predictor about things like this. It's just how it is. It is what it is, so to speak. Difference. This is continuous appositional growth through a lifetime. Different things. If your activities change, so for you, many of you who are going to be standing on your feet, you're going to have the thickness in the bones in the lower extremity. It's going to impact your hips. It's going to impact your back. If you're in a field where you have to do a lot of lifting, it's going to affect your upper extremity. All of those types of things that are there. And so basically, it's an interchange between the bone cells reverting between osteoclasts and, remember, the osteoblasts when they have to make more bone. And if we have to resorb bone, it's not like magically the bone is changing dramatically. Think of it more as a redistribution, and it's constantly active. And you're going to see in a second the role of the osteoclasts. They're able to really, so it's a continuous, I think redistribution is a better word. So there's usually more building up than breaking down bone, which leads to thicker, stronger bone that is not too heavy. So we can make, that compact bone really is the strength of the bone. And so if we make that thicker in other areas proportionally thinner, we don't have to have like massive bones necessarily. So they're trying, I mean, even with a bone like this, you begin to see some of the changes. I don't get a lot out of this slide, to be very honest with you, but they're trying to show you, here's the bone that's enlarged. This was the original contour. Now look at the contour here. So you can see how it was being redistributed. That's the most I get out of that. Not all the slides are good. This is the hormonal stuff coming up. I have it up on the board. We'll do this part first. Growth hormone. Surely, in growing bone, the most important hormone that's there. Infancy and childhood. It can continue into the adult. I'm sure it's released when we require bone healing. I mean, growth hormone is continuously released in your body. But that's there. But surely this is the most important. When you study endocrine, and you see about, this is a little intro to it, in AP2, okay, that's when you learn more about abnormalities, people with things called giantism or dwarfism, very rare disease called acromegaly, and a lot of times that's related to tumors in the pituitary. So growth hormone is one of the 6 principal hormones that's produced by the pituitary gland. Extraordinarily important. We make it. It's been used appropriately and unfortunately inappropriately as a performance enhancing drug. There's a whole lot to that stuff. I mean, whoever teaches you may get into it, maybe not. They're cool. It's not that terribly relevant in most fields. So that's what it does. Basically, it's stimulating the area at the epiphyseal plate, principally for elongation, and certainly not just interstitial, but appositional growth. If you didn't know it, thyroid hormone is important in every activity. Thyroid hormone, they say modulates or ensures proportion. It's more than that. If thyroid hormone is working properly, reproduction works, kidney works, heart works, muscles work. It's a governor. Basically, it controls your metabolic rate. And when you study thyroid in endocrine, you're going to see it plays a role in effectively every system. It's like if you've got a car that works great, it's like the engine. You just turn on the car, bing, hums, that's your thyroid working well. If you have my car with 150,000 miles, merely a baby, the last two got 250. I drive them until they're all over. That's low thyroid. And if you have the cars that my two boys had when they were teenagers, muscle cars, turn up, that's hyperthyroid. That's the best way to view it. It's so the metabolic activity, and it needs to be appropriate for whatever activity is doing. So thyroid's important in everything. Here, estrogen and progesterone, estrogen and testosterone, they're there. And again, they, at some juncture, they cause the end. And I mean, why the controls a certain time? Is it an overproduction? Are there other signals? I mean, I'm not really qualified to tell you about it. I really don't know. And so, and all of these, that's absolutely true. So there's a lot of variability that goes on. The big players I wrote up here. What triggers our bone as adults is really the bones live in the world where we calcium is important. Just start. After this unit, we do joints. We're going to do muscles. It's all about it. Calcium is maybe the pivotal piece in making those systems work. It really sets things in motion. So, bone is the storage vehicle for the vast 99% of our calcium. So you have to understand the controls. Principal control is a hormone that comes from parathyroid. Parathyroid and thyroid are not the same. Thyroid, we could do that. We could supplement it, we could deal with thyroid. Parathyroid, fatal. Parathyroid, because its job is making sure we have an adequate amount of calcium in our bloodstream. Parathyroid, hormone, we always refer to as PTH. See that as what we call acceptable abbreviation. Okay, well, it works in three areas. It works on bone by activating osteoclasts. We'll have to see a couple of slides about that, or one, breaking down the bone, and in doing so, it releases, not only does it destroy the bone substance or break it down, it releases the calcium into the bloodstream. So it elevates calcium in the bloodstream. At the same time, it activates your gut to absorb calcium, but in order to do that, it has to have vitamin D. That vitamin D works hand in hand with calcium. If you're taking a calcium supplement, and a lot of people should, the kind of calcium that's for you is called calcium carbonate. A lot of, particularly women, more prone to osteoporosis, we go into this. We'll talk about that. Tums and things like that are just basically calcium carbonate, because it cobbles up acidity, it's a buffer. And very often it will come calcitrated vitamin D. Oyster shell calcium, Oscal, they're all calcium carbonate, not all calcium. So you have to use the ones that are less likely to develop kidney stones. But vitamin D, very much a part of that, both when they're combined together. Without that, you can't absorb calcium from the gut. And again, what happens eventually decreases the amount of calcium in the bloodstream. And lastly, it tells the kidney, don't urinate out any calcium, we need to retain it, retain a fair amount. That too will release it. The oddball, the only one of these three hormones, and vitamin D is a hormone. Sure, you had it in skin, by skin and endocrine gland, because sunlight acts, it basically causes vitamin D to increase, has to be direct sunlight. Being inside again, seeing the sun through the window is insufficient. You're going to be out 15 to 20 minutes. Thyroid makes something called calcitonin. It's active in growing bone, despite some power. This one. That increases the calcium in bone. This increases the calcium in bone, and by doing so, it takes it out of the bloodstream, so it lowers the calcium. That's why I went through all that stuff. That's the metabolic. That, along with the growth hormone, the thyroid hormone, okay, are all part of that. Estrogens, testosterone. But the big players, when it comes to the bone itself, either pulling it out or putting it back in, testosterone, I beg your pardon, parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, and calcitonin. Here you go. This is where I get these numbers. And it's not, nobody's making them up. We're recycling up to 10% of your bone every year. Spongy bone, 3 to 4 years. Yours been replaced 4 or 5 times by now. Okay, compact bone, every 10 years. So what you were born with, no longer there. And the important take-home point is the notion about this continuous replacement. Your red blood cells, your white blood cells, most tissues, most structures have a lifespan, and we continue to replace them. Not your heart or your brain. That whole thing with the cell cycle. When it exits the cell cycle, it's good news and bad news. The bad news is we can't replace it anymore. So as long as it's in the cell cycle, at least we can make more. To understand, I mean, it's tough for students to not think of it because there's like a wholeness we think of ourselves. Well, this is me. This has been me since I was a little kid. Not on a cellular basis. You know, intellectually, emotionally, stuff I have no qualifications to teach you about. You get the idea? It's a fascinating area for me. So bone remodeling all the time, and they respond to different signals. Then it's mostly weight bearing and all those chemicals. And this is the osteoclast. How do they work? Effectively, this unit of white blood cells, these unit of macrophages that are combined into a giant cell, ruffled borders, okay, they secrete enzymes. The enzymes typically are in the form of phosphatases. They can involve acidity or alkalinity. In the case of bone, it's acid that helps. Acid helps to digest the material and release those calcium salts into the bloodstream. So the digested end products, dissolved minerals, transported across. Basically, the osteoclast is just that's that transcytosis, just going through the cell, not being interacted with. Okay, and then they gobble up some of the dead stuff, and then they undergo apoptosis. So that's the idea. They're there, and then we remake them. Sort of, it's like they basically have gobbled up their bone. That was their job. They've released all those chemicals. Now they're done, and we'll start all over again as we make this continuous process. So that's of note. Not necessarily something, but I want you to understand osteoclasts are typically activated by parathyroid hormone, and they release chemicals that gobble up. That's the mistake. Not just calcium salts. They gobble up bone. The organic, the osteoid, and the inorganic calcium salts. The organic stuff, they gobble up and recycle. The calcium is the part that's being regulated in your bloodstream. I'm not worried about osteoid seams or calcification fronts. Don't care. Okay. And so when we make new bone, the osteoid that's being secreted, the organic component attracts the calcium ions. Okay. And then there's a variety. This is where we look at, because new bone forms a chemical that you'll come to learn about, don't have to know for now, called alk-Phos. It's very important. You look at, that's one of those tests when you see all those blood tests. If you've ever had one done called BMP, Basic Metabolic Panel, that'll be on. So I'm not getting into explaining all those things for you. And it tells you what it does and the crystals. But one you have to remember is this. The mineral salts are in this very famous hydroxyapatite crystal, and that basically has the bone, how it forms within the bone. Building it up, removing it. And so this is classic negative feedback. We constantly need calcium, and we have to it's constantly changing in the bloodstream. Every time we need a little bit more, we activate this. And the minute we activate it, the minute some of that increases in the bloodstream, it immediately slows down. That's classic negative feedback. If we have too much in the bloodstream, it reverses itself. We put it back into the bone. Constantly there. That's the major control. The other are stressors, physical. Imagine somebody who was in the International Space Station for 6 months and came back to Earth. They were effectively weightless for this immense amount of time. There's no stressors that are there. Those bones will, to some degree, become osteoporotic. I am sure, I do not know for sure, but I am confident rather, that when they come back and they're brought back to Earth with gravity, that they must go through a process of making sure they're sort of gradually returned to activities because the bones wouldn't be able to tolerate it. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, but it's the same thing if you were bedridden because of a terrible injury or some terrible illness. The same thing, your bones you couldn't go back out and run a marathon. Right? Just not going to happen. So calcium underscore. This is something, to me, this is sort of the calcium and potassium are this very, very interesting roles that they play that you see more in AP2. Okay, without it, nerves can't fire, muscles can't work. 99% of the calcium is in the bone. That's around 3 pounds. You do the metric conversion, kilogram, 1,000 grams, 2.2. Okay, calcium requiring vitamin D, that's a big player. So I'm trying to highlight the points that you definitely have to be familiar with. Here's the parathyroid hormone. Comes from the parathyroid gland. The way it does its magic is through osteoclasts when it works on the bone. Okay, and again, calcitonin is in the thyroid. We'll get to that. Then you get that in endocrine. I don't want to overstate it, just to know basically what it does in response to high levels of blood calcium. Its effects in adults we think are negligible. There are studies being done to effectively see if it is a useful treatment for osteoporosis. We've never come up with there's no magical pill for osteoporosis. They've tried a lot of things and a lot of things help. They all have significant side effects. That's the best way to describe it. So, I mean, if whoever did this thinks the effects are negligible, fine with them. Again, they're not bone scholars. They make PowerPoints. I don't get a lot out of that. Maybe you do. So all the things, and it's interesting. Potassium and calcium all have these effects. And calcium, in general, you have to look at the specific system. Low levels makes things, nerves and muscles, hyperexcitable. High levels, non-responsive. I wouldn't ask you about that because you have to give a specific example. That's more of an AP2 question. And this is the whole idea about is forming in bad places. Okay, high calcium, blood vessels, and blood vessels are damaged all the time. In some instances, aging, diabetics more than others, and kidney stones, a big problem for young folks. We used to be mostly older. We see a lot more problem. Interestingly, in young women, has been an increasing area, and they are very unpleasant. And here's the calcitonin. Okay, again, I think you just have to accept the fact that its main role in growing bone is to put calcium back into bone. And there's other things that play a role as well. This is the Wolff's Law portion of it. Stresses they encounter. Okay. So, and bones and what happens where they're bending, you'll see the hip in a second. That's where they strengthen. That's where they increase in the diameter, or they increase in the diameter, wrong term, to increase the amount of cortical bone where the stress is. And interestingly, that's where it can give way. And they bend in the other area to deal with the stress, and you will see it. So the shaft is thickest where the bending stresses are greatest, and basically can be hollow because compression, they cancel each other out. If it's thick where it needs to be and thin where it needs to be, then we basically have sort of designed a sort of elegant tubular structure to deal with the stress. And they're showing it to you here. So understand, all of your weight comes through this area, through the acetabulum into the head and neck of the femur. It's always thicker here. Also, it's in this area where it tends to give way. So even though thickness helps, you reach a point where the stress will just overcome the thickness. And more often than not, when grandma fractures a hip, grandma didn't fall. and then the hip broke. The hip broke and grandma fell. Because fractures in older people are what we call pathological fractures. They come from, okay, weakness in the bone, typically osteoporosis more than the other. And they stretch here. So it gets thinned out here a little bit. Okay. And then you can identify this with handedness, right side for right handed, left for left handed. Okay. So that thickness is where they're most likely to buckle. That's why we see those trabecular patterns you're going to see when we look at x-rays under the area. And again, weightlifters, very physically active athletes, you can see the large trochanters, the tubercles, the tuberosities, the spines, where, I mean, fetus notwithstanding, somebody who's been in bed for a long period of time, it can go away. And if it's prolonged, it may never be able to come back. And this is the other little nugget. I'm not going to ask a question about it, but there's a thing that when I was in school, we called electronic bone healing. I actually had patients where we incorporated like plates in here with a plug that protruded from a cast or from a removable cast. And they have to plug themselves in for 8 to 12 hours because it's charged particles, and you put it over the area of the fracture with one that you thought could be slow healing or potentially be a problem with a non-healing fracture. So I had patients who utilized that. It was developed at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and I do not know if it's used today. That's why I wouldn't ask any questions. If you go into a field where there's a lot of orthopedics, you'll find out. And so all of that's part of it. And then I'll summarize it. This is where I left it. When we talk about, I go crazy. People have been told so many stupid things. When they go to, oh, I went and got an x-ray of my ankle, I twisted. It's just a tiny crack. It's not a fracture. Or I hurt my wrist. They said it was a chip. It's not a fracture. I don't have to worry. A break in the integrity, a discontinuity, an alteration in the integrity or interruption in the integrity of bone is a fracture. Period. End of sentence. Whether or not you have to treat it, whether or not it hurts you, all of that doesn't apply. That's somebody. There's a difference between a scientific explanation and an explanation, placating somebody with an explanation. I don't want to get started because I'll go crazy. Thank you. Have fun. Bye. Friday. We're doing fractures. It'll be fun.